Hi, this is Guy Wallace. I started in learning and development way back in 1979, and I semi-retired in 2023. But my current mission as a semi-retired L&D professional is to help enterprise learning and development organizations become more performance-based. Welcome to my podcast. This episode is a recording of Neil Rackham of spin selling fame when he was at Motorola back in 1981 talking about negotiations, in particular push-pull approaches to negotiations. Let's listen in.
3. So those are the 3 things I want. I'm trying to persuade you to accept points 1, 2 and 3. Yeah? And you want points 3, 4 and 5. Now, just check you've got this. I want 1, 2 and 3. You want 3, 4 and 5. 3 we have in common. We both want 3. 2 and 4 aren't so far apart, but 1 and 5 are miles apart. Okay? And these are the 5 issues we're discussing. Clear? Okay? Now let's have a look at me using a push style to get what I want. If I'm using a push style, I'll come to you and say, I think we should do 1, 2 and 3. No, I don't want to hear what you've got to say. The reason why we should do 1 is this, and 2, now here's why we should do 2. And 3, yeah, we'll do it for this reason. No, shut up. If you're not convinced, I'll give you some more arguments. Now, if you don't cave in under that, the question is, you have 3, 4 and 5, and you're being pressured and you're having difficulty getting your word in, so you decide to stand up to me. Which of your arguments are you going to give? The one we've got in common, the one in the middle, or the one that is at the extreme? The one at the extreme. Yeah. Then basically, you will raise either point 5 or you'll say, I cannot accept 1. Yeah? And very soon it becomes 1 versus 5. So we can say a push style tends to emphasize the extremes. That's why it's win-lose. You talk to any pusher, and this guy, a true pusher, someone who is hooked on push style, will usually have people he loves, people he hates. Yeah? Doesn't feel neutrally about anything, because the whole nature of the push style is when you are being pushed, you tend to come up with the opposites if you're going to stand up to the guy. So it becomes more of a battle. Now, the danger of that push style is that you end up winning some and losing some. Let's in contrast look at a pull style. If I'm using a pull style, I'm smart. I could very well say, what do you think? And get you to tell me you think 3, 4 and 5. Now, we often mistakenly see a push style as being a manipulative, don't care about people, and a pull style being care about people, sensitive style. That's bullshit. Yeah, because what I can do now, you're with me. You're there. What I can say is, what do you think? How do you feel about it? And you say, I think we should do 3, 4 and 5. Then I'm really smart. I will say to you, remember, I want 1, 2 and 3, okay? And you're saying, let's do 3, 4 and 5. I'll say, tell you what, let me see if I really understand this point 3 you're making. Tell me more about that. Convince me about that. I'll ask you a lot of questions. In the end, I say, okay, tell you what I'll do. I'll accept your point 3 if you'll accept point 2. You can put those 2 together, I'll buy. And the chances are you'll say, yeah, because I've accepted your point and you've accepted mine. Seems fair. I probably won't get you to accept 1, but see what I've done? I've used the common ground to trade off against what I want. And a pull style starts from common ground and builds. It can be used very manipulatively.
It's a winner take all with no compromise.
Well, the push style is a winner take all. Yeah. So there, if you feel you can play for the stakes and win, then sometimes that's a style that you go for. But here, this is potentially a more manipulative style. Anyway, let me just give you one final piece of advice, and then we'll break for coffee. And my piece of advice is this. I once did something very dangerous. I was asked by someone in a group like this, if you work for a pusher, what style would you adopt? I mean, does a pusher work best with a puller? Which style works against which one? I think that's an interesting question. I haven't got an answer. So I went around and I did that very dangerous thing that I tell everyone else not to do. I tried to build up a model by asking people what they did, because people never know what they do. And I went to various pushers and I said, what sort of person do you like working for you? And they came with almost a universal answer. They said, I like a guy with the capacity to stand up with me. I like a strong person, someone who knows what they think, who's prepared to push for their ideas. So we mistakenly advise a lot of people, if your boss tends to be a pusher, push back. Actually, what we find in the truth, when we actually watch these people, is the truth is like this. What the pusher likes is this. The pusher likes the guy who will come into his office and say, listen, we've got to do this. I'm convinced of it. This is a big issue to me. It's a resignation issue. This is what we've got to do. And the pusher says, no. The guy says, oh, your brilliant logic convinces me. Wow, I hadn't seen it that way. You're right. In other words, pushers tend to like unsuccessful pushers. Consequently, I wouldn't like to give you any recipes there for success. Anyway, at this stage, let's break. Let's have coffee. Try and be back here for 10:30.
Neil, I got one more question.
As I say, I showed you that because that's one piece of unpublished research, and for me, as a researcher, it raises many more questions than it answers. Here's one of the nice things about research. Every time you do a piece of research, you end up with more unknowns than you started, and that's how you keep yourself in business. For me, that raises all sorts of things that I know nothing about and want to investigate further. But it does bring us, though, to the two other areas I want to talk to you about briefly. And one of those areas is to do with negotiation, and the other is to do with selling. And I'm not sure which to talk about first. I don't really worry too much. Maybe what we ought to do is talk about negotiation first and work up to selling. And then finally I'll talk to you about the results, unless we do it the other way around. As you can see, I'm in the middle ground right now. Maybe not the most effective position. Let me though perhaps say a little bit about how selling and negotiation are different. If you had to, in a sentence, just say what the difference is between a selling situation and a negotiating situation, what would you say was the essential difference? Bullshit.
Compromise.
Compromise. That's an interesting word. What compromise implies is something beyond that, and that is, in a negotiation, you always have the power to vary the terms. Because if you cannot vary the terms, you're not negotiating, you're selling. Yeah? So if there's a fixed price, a fixed delivery, a fixed spec, all you can go in is sell to that. But the moment something could vary, you have the potential to negotiate. I think we ask ourselves, what is negotiation? What we could say is this. Clearly, an aspect of negotiation is that you can vary the terms of the agreement. They're not fixed. In that way, we don't negotiate usually over the price of a can of beans in the store, because that's a fixed price. On the other hand, we do tend to negotiate about a second-hand car, because a used car is negotiable. Yeah. Secondly, if we look at what makes negotiation, in almost any negotiation, there is going to be a position that looks like this. In this circle is what I want, and in this circle is what you want. It has to be like that in a negotiation. There's just no alternative. After all, if what I want and what you want don't overlap at all, what can I trade off? What can I give you? Nothing. There's nothing you've got that I want. And in the case of a sales negotiation, this piece in the middle is both you and the customer want to get something in place. Yeah? Want to solve a problem. It's just that you would like to solve it perhaps in a rather different way to the way the customer would like to solve it. On the other hand, if I and you are in the same circle, if there is absolute agreement, then why are we negotiating anyway? If we're in agreement. And that one fact contains an essential message about the nature of negotiation. Negotiation always has an area of agreement and an area of potential conflict. That always must exist in any negotiation, otherwise it's not a negotiation. If there's no chance of agreement, the two sides have nothing to gain from negotiating. If the agreement is total, there's no reason to negotiate. So that again becomes an essential aspect of negotiation. Now, if we say then a lot of the situations that you find yourself in are going to be of that kind, we could bring a third criterion for what makes a negotiation, which is even more common, and that is negotiations tend to be around scarce resources. If there's enough of something, we don't tend to negotiate. If you come into this room and there's not enough chairs for everyone to sit down, having a chair or not having a chair becomes a negotiable issue, because chairs are scarce. Consequently, we tend to negotiate about budgets because money's scarce. We tend to negotiate about priorities because time is scarce. Now, if you look at it that way, negotiation is quite a wide process. And I want to put it to you this way because I don't want you to see negotiation as solely something that goes on formally across the table. The most interesting types of negotiation aren't of that kind. They're the interactions you have inside the company or with customers where those conditions exist. You have some latitude, some flexibility to vary the terms, otherwise compromise is possible. That what you want and what the other person wants differs slightly, but there is an area of overlap. That almost invariably you're talking about a scarce resource. And if you have those three conditions, you have a negotiation. Now, what do we know about the effective negotiator? I'm going to dodge a lot of the research in terms of the planning of negotiation. I just want to talk to you very briefly about negotiation behavior. And I think you'll see some messages that tie in with other messages we've made this morning and at other times. We used our good old method. We found 102 very skilled negotiators. As you know, we studied 102 negotiation sessions. Anyway, we found our skilled negotiators and we went and watched them across a range of negotiations and just saw what they did. It was different from average negotiators. Incidentally, could I say here, you'll often read books on negotiation, which give you lots of advice about how to negotiate. Unfortunately, the majority of these books are in the technical jargon of us research psychologists bullshit. For a number of reasons. One reason is that some of them are just supposition without any supporting evidence. The kind of thing that when the buyer crosses his legs that way, so his leg points to the door, it means that he's going against you, and people, all this stuff around body language is fascinating, but with very little demonstrated validity as yet. People are still working on it, and maybe in a few years we'll understand it better, but as now, there's a load of junk talk that way. Also, there are some problems about method. Again, asking people what they do and what they actually do are very different. And in particular, there's one area that I must advise you about. If you look at our stuff, you'll find it's very different from some of the things you'll read. And one of the reasons is this. We were interested in a particular type of negotiation. Most of the studies on negotiation are to do with bringing a couple of people together who've never met each other before and who will never meet each other again, and saying negotiate and seeing what the person who wins did. Now the rule is you can con anyone once. So what you tend to find from those studies is that the use of dirty tricks wins out, the use of hardline tactics wins out. And yet, if you think of your negotiations, if you think of things that go back to what we're considering here, in most of the negotiations that you're concerned with, you'll meet that person again. You live with the consequences of those negotiations, whether it's inside the company or with customers. Consequently, we have to reject straight away the dirty tricks approach to negotiation, which says if you really twist the customer in this sort of way or your colleagues in this kind of way, you can get what you want in the short term. That's not a good strategy of long-term negotiation in order to keep and grow an effective working relationship. So I'm talking about a particular variety of negotiation, not the negotiation which will win you what you want today on a Monday afternoon and by Tuesday morning the whole thing has fallen apart. That is not, for me, an effective negotiation arena. I'm talking about how you deal with those people you have to negotiate with day in, day out. People where you have to live with the consequences of whatever you've persuaded them. Now let's have a look at what the effective negotiator tends to do or not do inside the negotiation. I won't go through all this research because there was an awful lot of it, but let me start with some of the things that the effective negotiator tends to avoid during the negotiation, and see if I can pull out of this a few lessons which might help you in your own negotiations. What I'll do is I'll pull out a mixture of things that I think are important and things that amuse me because why should I take any notice of your needs? Let me start off by saying there's one thing which very clearly has been a dilemma in negotiation for a long time, and we tried to settle it in the negotiations we watched, and that is, broadly speaking, a lot of the research in negotiation has two opposite views that are being pushed. One is to say the best negotiators are very aggressive, and the use of aggression in negotiation, the sort of winning through intimidation philosophy, is a very good negotiating style. Now what we wanted to know was, what does that work in real life? So after all, we might not feel we would like it to work, but so often what actually works and what you'd like are two different things. The question is, does it work? Do real negotiators act very aggressively? One of the things which is often advised in negotiating programs is that people should personally attack hard and use a lot of attacking behavior. Does that work? Well, what we found was no. If you look at the amount of defending attacking, one of the categories we discussed before, we've discovered that there was a low amount of defending attacking, particularly what we call the defending attacking spiral. One of the things you notice is that when people have a conflict, a negotiation always is about conflict. If there's no conflict, then it shouldn't be negotiated. When you have a conflict, you also have the tendency for people to get wound up. And what tends to happen is most people make a negotiating error here. If I am negotiating with you, I will very often pick up a small stone and throw it at you to see what will happen. And you'll pick up a larger stone and throw it back at me, and I'll pick up half a brick, and before we know, we've got into a spiral. So what tends to happen is people in negotiations say, excuse me, but I don't think your side is being entirely honest about this. Small attack. And so I said, what the hell do you mean? Honest. We were the ones who put that down. No, what are you saying? And before you know what happens, up it goes. You watch the nature by which disputes go, and it is a spiral. One person's attack stokes a counter-attack, and up it goes. Now, what we found was the effective negotiator tended to avoid those defending attacking spirals. However, the writers who suggested that aggression was a good thing in negotiation weren't entirely wrong. If you watch outstanding negotiators, it wasn't that they would never attack. They would sometimes, but when they were going to attack, bang! Without warning, they were lying unconscious and bleeding on the floor. Yeah? It's like a push style, use 100%. Think of people that you've had to deal with who are really scary negotiators. And sometimes, without any warning, they'll turn on you, bang! And they'll just come straight back off. Yeah? They never get into that spiral. If they're going to hit you, they hit you once hard. And those people are people you really worry about when you negotiate with. So, in terms of your own negotiation behaviour, I'm not suggesting that you should indulge in attacking behaviour necessarily. What I am saying is this: just as in a push style, don't do it 90%. The worst thing you can do, if you are going to throw stones, is to throw a little stone. Yeah? If you decide to attack, it's very important to attack hard once, cleanly, and finish it. That's what the effective negotiator tends to do. But having said that, the effective negotiator uses that very sparingly. We didn't see anyone who was successful in negotiation who tended to work continually by attacking others. That's because the kind of negotiations we were interested in were negotiations to do with an ongoing relationship, not one-off negotiations which just ended there. Next thing I show you, just because it's fun, not because it's terribly profound, most of us know, especially, this is where it's a big advantage having been in sales. When you're in sales, you learn to control yourself in the customer's office come hell or high water. So you learn how to keep cool when you are under attack, and you don't respond in the same way as people who haven't got that background tend to respond. However, there is something which we all tend to do in negotiation. If you control yourself and you don't attack the other party, what you may find yourself doing is using things that we called irritators. And irritators are little words or phrases that add nothing at all to the communication, but do serve to irritate the other people which you're negotiating with. A good example is all one word, this word, the generous offer. If I say to you, this is a very generous offer that I'm making, what does that word generous do? Does it actually convince you of anything? Or is it really a way of me saying, you are being mean? If I say, well, we are being very fair and reasonable with you, do I convince you at all when I talk of fair and reasonable? I don't think so. What I'm doing is trying to put to you in a more indirect way, I think you are being unfair and unreasonable. Yeah? And that's the effect of the communication. What we find is these irritators tend to be used much, much more by inexperienced negotiators or by negotiators who weren't so successful as the ones we studied. But I put that in just because you can't watch a negotiation without hearing a lot of those value words creeping in. They're usually value words to give positive value to what you are saying. They don't cut any ice with either side. The skilled people avoid them. Let me look at a third thing here. So I find this as an interesting thing. It will help you. The next 2 points are more important. They will help you a lot, I hope, in your own negotiation. That's this. I had always been taught, when I was taught negotiation, The basic nature of a negotiation was this. I put forward a proposal of some kind. Here's what we want. You put forward a counter-proposal. Here's what we want. We assess the difference between them and we start bargaining. Yeah? So I've been taught that negotiation proceeds by proposal and counter-proposal. One of the things we found very interesting was that skilled negotiators tended to avoid counter-proposals. That's just what they didn't do. It puzzled us for a long time about why that might be. But in the end, we began to get a handle on it. Suppose you make a proposal to me. You say, we suggest that you take 5 of these and you take them in this sort of configuration. And I say, I suggest we do a further evaluation study before we decide. Yeah? You've made a proposal, I've made a counter-proposal. Now, let's think of the psychology of this. I think I have put forward an idea to you, a proposal. But what are you actually hearing? You put forward a proposal to me, so what are you listening for? Yep, you're listening for acceptance. So when I say I suggest we do a further evaluation study, what do you take that as being? An objection, a disagreement. So what happens is, I have put something to you at the point where you are least receptive. People are least receptive to ideas straight after they put an idea of their own. We all know that, yeah? If I put an idea to you, I'm not going to listen to an idea you bring back. All I'm listening to is how you are reacting to what I say. And consequently, if you put a perfectly reasonable counter-proposal, I will see it as in opposition, and I'll be looking for its flaws. You want a very skilled negotiator, and they do something different. The very top negotiators will tend to do this. If you put your proposal first, they tend to ask no questions about it. They say, you say 6 leads in this configuration. How does this work? Why that? I don't understand this. This really troubles me. I feel troubled by this. I can't understand why you're doing it that way. No, this is giving me real difficulty. And they allow you to let your proposal dilute, and then, when you seem to be getting nowhere, they'll say, I suggest we do a further evaluation study before we decide. Yeah? See the difference in psychology? They've allowed your proposal to dilute itself and to get played out before they put theirs in. Watch out for that, because in a lot of customer situations, you'll find yourself counter-proposing. It's almost like jumping in with advantages. You get objections. Yeah? And in fact, as you go into this, there are links all the way through, because in negotiation, in selling, in management, we are talking about the interaction between people. And some of the same fundamental basic rules apply. Jump in with answers when someone isn't receptive and you get objections. Jump in with your counter-proposal at the worst possible moment when someone has just made a proposal to you and you won't get a response. So in terms of how you should handle this, just try and train yourself so that when the customer or someone inside the company puts forward a proposal to you, don't say, oh, well, I think a better way would be. That's fatal, because you can have an excellent idea lost because you put it at psychologically the worst moment. Always spend time considering, examining, talking about the idea that's been put to you. And if it's an idea you don't like, diluting it, rather, by the questions you ask. Now, those are important, but I want to now look at one thing the skilled negotiator avoids that is so important. I'll put a big star here. If you remember nothing else from today, nothing else at all, not even the seduction stuff, remember this one thing, because I have no doubt this will be by far the most useful single thing that I could tell you. And out of all the research we've ever done, including the spin stuff, I think this single, simple discovery has helped more people in a more profound way than anything else. And that's this. We are trained, particularly those of us who have had the misfortune of higher education, we are trained to think that there is something smart about being able to think of 5 reasons for anything we want to do, rather than just one reason. Yeah? The more reasons and justification you can provide, the stronger your case. In fact, this is even embedded in the English language and in the French language. The idea, we speak, don't we, of the weight of the argument. That's a model that sees an argument as a pair of scales, where the more arguments you can put into your side, the more you, we say, tip the balance of the argument in your favour. Yeah? Even built into our language is the model that an argument is a balance and the weight of the argument wins it. The more reasons you can produce, the better. And we're trained in that and encouraged in that in the educational system. Yeah? It's seen as great in debate if you can think up 4 or 5 reasons to back what it is you want to do. But in fact, that's fatal. See, suppose I have 5 reasons to back my case. And I say to you, well, here are 5 things to support my case. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And suppose number 1 and 2 are so strong you can't deny them, and number 3 is pretty weak. What are you going to do? You're going to go in and show that 3 is invalid. And what's that done to the psychological strength of my case? It's destroyed it. Because you only have to find one hole to be able to legitimately deny a position. It's a rule of interaction. If you can find a flaw, you're safe. You watch the brilliant negotiators. They're much more likely to say, the reason is this. And give one point to take their case. And if you can't deny that point, they're in a mighty strong position. They avoid the thing which we would call argument dilution. Because the true model is not the model of a pair of scales. It's a model of having some pretty good liquor and pouring a rather inferior mixer into it. You dilute. The rule I'd like you to remember is this. A weak argument dilutes a strong. It does not add, it takes away. Now, if ever you're up against a master negotiator, that can be used on you. I've seen some superb negotiators who will say, well, Mike, what do you think about this? You put forward this case, what's your reason for it? And Mike puts forward saying, is that your only reason? And Mike obligingly says, oh, no, there's another one. And really? And just those 2 are no other reason for doing it? And Mike says, well, there is another, it's this. Then bang, they're in on a weak point. You watch any very, very competent internal management negotiator in a company. You watch the kinds of things that kind of go on in justification of budgets and plans and proposals. And someone who's really smart and knows how to handle that, they'll be asking you, tell me more, justify more, I want to hear more. Because they're really getting you talking until that weak point comes along. The counter to that, of course, in the really good negotiator, is if I would say to Mike, what's your reason? And he says, it's this, and I say, is that the only one? Of course, to come back and say, do you accept? Have you any objection to it on that basis? What's wrong with that reason? Now, the skilled negotiator therefore tends to choose the key reason, use it, try and win the case on that. If he's calculated wrong, and there's a flaw there, he then goes to his backup reason. But he tries to win the case there and then on one issue. He doesn't muddy the water with more and more. He doesn't expose a flank. If you remember that, that will really help you. Incidentally, one of the things we noticed is that some of the greatest natural negotiators of all time, who are dealers in scrap metal, used cars, and other such individuals, rarely have a PhD in behavioural sciences. And it made us think that maybe we found in our good negotiators there was a negative correlation with education. That the more education you've had, the more impediment there is, because education teaches you a kind of set of rules which is not natural human psychological rules, but is an arbitrary aesthetic from Aristotelian logic. Excuse me, saying it this way. The bottom line is you're taught to argue in a particular way that is not related to the demands of real life. And everyone plays by those rules and respects the rules, so it's fine when you are going through the educational process. But when you come out the other end, you find it's not always been the best preparation for life. A good example, has anyone got small kids? If you've got small children, one of the things you will find is they're often brilliant negotiators. Because a little kid will take one argument and stick with it. Yeah? And my gosh, they can give you trouble. And they win a hell of a lot of cases on that basis. Of course, when the poor little bastards get into the educational system, they come back and they try and argue with you logically, and then you start winning again. But basically, that whole concept of argument dilution, very important concept. Watch out for that. More people lose cases which they should be winning through argument dilution than anything else. And a lot of people, again, without sometimes consciously realizing that they do it, tempt others into argument dilution as a negotiating strategy. So you'll find if you're up against a really experienced buyer, haven't you seen them do that to you? One of the things that some of you said last time was, when you're up against a very experienced buyer, the buyer seems to be asking you all the questions. Remember? We discussed that last time. Why do you think that is? One of the reasons is to tempt you into argument dilution. To give more and more things until you raise something where the buyer feels, got it. Consequently, be very, very careful. It's sometimes hard to avoid, but don't actively and joyfully leap into it. Yeah? If I'm watching people negotiate, probably the biggest single flaw I see time and time again is that they cannot resist, actually of their own accord, interrupting people in order to dilute their own argument. Yeah? And it happens to all of us. So watch out for that. And if you don't remember anything else I've said today, if you remember that, that will be worth the coming here today. Yeah? That's one thing. Anyway, if these are things that the skilled negotiator avoids, let's have a look at some of the things on the positive side the skilled negotiator uses. Now, again, I'm going to pick out 4 things, and they're not all going to be equally important. In fact, the first one isn't important at all, and I put it in because I like it. And that is, it seems that let me go back to me doing this research. This is maybe the best way to explain it. When we started doing this research, what we expected was this. It would be very difficult to do a behavior analysis of a skilled negotiator. Just like I think you've seen with some of your salespeople. Some of them it's very easy to do a spin analysis, and others it's very difficult. Yeah? And it's often the person. Some people behave in a very clear way, dead centre of the categories they're using. Some, well, they behave in a way where it could be this or it could be that. When we began this research, we thought that the skilled negotiator would be someone who was very ambiguous, very difficult to work out. You wouldn't know when they said something whether it meant this or that. they'd be rather slimy characters. You know, they'd really know how to position themselves so they were covered from all angles. That wasn't true. We found that the skilled negotiators were very, very easy to observe. We then began asking ourselves, why is that? And we noted that they were using a particular type of behavior. Let me show you some of the contrasts. The average negotiator would make a suggestion, say, well, I suggest we do this. And out would come the suggestion. And ask questions, make statements, all those categories that we were looking at back here. But now let's look at the different ways in which those behaviours were used. Because you find this. Whereas, if I'm just Mr. Average, I would say, what do you think about this? Or I suggest we do that. In other words, I would propose or I would seek. The skilled guy would do something with him. He would say, could I ask you a question? And then he'd seek information. He wouldn't just say, I suggest we do this. He'd say, excuse me, I'd like to make a proposal. And then he'd make a proposal. He wouldn't just say, well, then we've agreed this, this, and this. He'd say, at this point, gentlemen, I would like to summarize. I believe we have agreed this, this, and this. In other words, he was labelling the kind of behaviour that he was using. Now, that's no great discovery. That he uses behaviour labelling. He tells you what's coming. I can see that it could have certain advantages in a negotiation. Like what? Why would that be a good thing to use in negotiation? To tell people what's coming.
Sets the stage, yeah.
Sets the stage.
So they can think of a whole bunch of reasons why not to.
Well, or maybe the other way around. Yeah? Because one of the things you do find is if I'm saying, could I ask you a question? Chances are you're going to say yes, because you're a very unreasonable guy if you say no. But I've already actually predisposed you a little bit towards my way of thinking because I've got a positive from you before the question comes. Whereas if I just fling a question at you, your head might be full of all sorts of other stuff. So sometimes it can work the other way. But certainly it clarifies the communication, it gives some thinking time, it creates a more positive atmosphere. But that isn't what interests me. What I'm interested in is the exception. Of these behaviours we've got here, there's one of them which is different. It's not defending attacking, which happens to be crossed out because we've already seen that the skilled negotiator tends to be very cautious about that behaviour. If you look at these other behaviours here, there is one of those behaviours which the skilled negotiator does not label and let people know that it's coming, and the rest of us nearly always do. Any bids?
Shutting up.
Shutting out? Yeah, but as shutting out is mostly an interruption, I tend to... You don't usually tell people you're interrupting them, you just interrupt them. Another one? Yeah, disagreeing. See, let's look at something, and I find this personally a fascinating little insight into the neurocircuitry of the brain. And I kid you not, you'll see in a moment. The skilled negotiator tends to go this way round. He says, here is my reason. Therefore, I disagree. The average negotiator does it like this. He says, I disagree because, and here's my reason. Now, is one of those ways more persuasive than the other? Likely to be more successful? You'd say that probably the skilled negotiator is doing that for a reason. And it's logical to do it. Why? Why would this way be better than that way?
Because you're setting a positive stage.
Yeah, people maybe listen to your reason more neutrally. So if this way is better, why the blue blazers do, most of us do it this way round? Nature. Say more.
To react to someone, somebody saying something that's not the way you're thinking. Throwing a stone.
I think you're right when you talk about nature. I think the real reason here goes very, very deep, literally, into brain circuitry. You see, the human mechanism is a quite well constructed one. You say things that way round, I disagree because, you say it for one simple reason. You say it that way round because you thought it that way round. If you're listening to what someone else is saying, don't kid yourself that you're logically saying, what are the reasons for, what are the reasons against? There are more reasons against than there are for, therefore I disagree. If you thought it that way round, you'd probably say it that way round. What actually happens is you listen to what someone else is saying, and you think, that's bullshit, I don't agree with that, and then you find the reason why. You make the decision first, and then you search for the reason, and that's why you say it that way round. Now, the reason why it's in the neurocircuitry of the brain is that, for all I know, there may once have been a race of beings who thought it the logical way round. Who, when the rock was falling from on high, said, what are the advantages of jumping to the left? What are the advantages of jumping to the right? That precipitated that decision. And we needed that to survive. But the thing which I find just fascinating is in our research, the successful negotiators had somehow, and I've never met one who was actually consciously aware of it, they had trained themselves not to do this. Because, notice, if what I say is true, if deep in the circuitry of your brain, the way it works is you make the decisions and then you search in your filing cabinets for the reasons. Now just imagine what happens if I say, I disagree with you because. What am I telling you to do? Well, I may hope I'm telling you to do that, but what do I do in reality? Because if we make the decision first and look for the reasons afterwards, am I not telling you, right now, I disagree with you, meaning you're going to look in your files for reasons against what I'm about to say. Yeah? And that's how we operate. And that's why the skilled negotiator, for reasons I don't know, because they're usually not aware of it, although they will tend to say, I'd like to make a suggestion. Could I ask you a question? Let me summarize where we are here. Could I build on this? They will not say, I'd like to disagree with you. That's the one thing which they hold back because it actively damages their position. Now, I show it to you not because I consider that to be a make or break issue in negotiation, but it is very nice sometimes for a researcher like me to occasionally find something which shows that the way we interact and behave with each other can be traced all the way back to the mechanisms of the brain. And I just find that personally rather interesting, so screw you. I felt it was necessary to show it. Now, the next thing that I'd like to share with you is something which I think we can well understand and have a parallel with other areas we've looked at. The skilled negotiator uses lots of questions. Seeking behavior for the skilled negotiator is very hard. Now, I think we should in the last few months have seen all the reasons why questions are very effective in any interaction. Yeah? They're much more persuasive than statements. It's a nice parallel here between selling and negotiation, that both of them depend on questions. The skilled negotiator is asking roughly twice as many questions in a negotiation as the average negotiator. The whole negotiation depends on questions. You'll come across a skilled buyer and you'll find that's how they'll negotiate with you. They won't make long statements about their position. They don't want to tell you that. They maintain a relatively low level of reaction and they fire questions at you. Now, what's the value of questions in a negotiation that goes beyond their value in sales calls? And any views? Why are questions so important?
Forces your opponent to think of answers to the question while you formulate new.
Absolutely. I remember this rather ruefully. The first major contract I ever signed in the United States, I signed with a guy who I now think to be a crooked lawyer in New York. And this guy was really very smart. He'd say things like, Neil, I don't understand what this clause 9 says on the contract. I know you've been through it a few times with me, but I really am having some difficulty with it. Will you please go through it again? And we keep coming back to this wretched clause. It wasn't until afterwards, when he tied me up in one hell of a contract, that he was prepared to say, shit, I knew everything about that one. That was the one clause I was absolutely clear on. But while you were rabbiting on about it, I was able to think where I was going to go next. And when you think about it, think what happens to you when you have a strategy you want to pursue with a customer. And you go in the customer's office and the customer starts questioning you. And who has control? If the customer takes control, the person asking questions has control. One of the things which we sometimes do when we're training people in negotiation is we set up a negotiation where we say to one side, for the next 10 minutes you cannot ask any questions. And one of the things you always find is that group disintegrates. Because if you can't ask questions, all you can do is make statements. So you are offering your position to people for them to probe and work on. So questions are very important, not only for the reasons they're important in selling, but for these other reasons of getting control and allowing thinking time. Another thing which we found was that there was also a very high level of testing and summarizing. And what I'd like to do here is put a star by this, because this is the thing I would like you to remember here. See, I made a big mistake. Let me tell you about my own incompetence. And this is all incompetence anyway. And see why I made that mistake and how it relates to this. Researchers are not honest people. You know? Researchers are usually desperately crooked because they're chasing after an idea and they want to prove that their idea is right. Consequently, they will distort anything that they observe or see in order to create data to back their point of view. And I am as corrupt, if not more corrupt, than the average person in the business. So the way we kept ourselves honest in this particular study was this. The person who chose the negotiators for us to see sent us out to see skilled negotiators and average negotiators all mixed up randomly, but didn't let us know whether the person we were going to see was a highly skilled negotiator or just merely an experienced negotiator who didn't have very much skill. Being human, of course, the first thing we did, the research team, is as we sat down and watched this negotiation, we were trying to figure out, is this guy skilled or not? And over and over again, I'd see something like this happen. There I would be, watching a negotiation, and they'd come very near to this thing that's happened to all of us, this delicate eggshell thing, an agreement. And you know how, if you've ever negotiated a really big contract, sometimes it kind of hush falls, yeah? It goes very quiet. You know you're so near that agreement. And I tried to look very small, hold my breath, as I felt this great psychological moment was coming. So the negotiator would say, wait a minute, do you know what you're signing? Do you really understand it? You know, what this means, this clause here, you realise that you're going to have to do this, don't you? The other people say, Oh shit, no, that's not how we understood it. No, look, hold on. Look, excuse us, I think we better go back and discuss this, and off they go to another room. And I think the idiot, he's blown it. And I'd go back to the office and I'd say, oh, you sent me to see her. Right, burnt it down, I haven't seen anything as bad as this. And I'd see from the funny expression in their eyes that I had backed the wrong one. And I now realise something that I didn't realise then. And that's this. This delicate eggshell thing, an agreement. You sign it, you wrap it in cotton wool, you take it out, and that is life. You know? And the rule is this: anything that is not strong enough to stand up to rigorous testing at the point where it's agreed is almost certain to bring you a load of trouble later. You see, here's the difference between the objective of the very skilled negotiator and the average negotiator. I've fallen into this one. When I'm negotiating, as a pretty average negotiator, I tend to see as my objective getting an agreement. That's what I want, an agreement. I want the business. So I agree, and I get the business, and I know that there are things that the people I'm negotiating with may not entirely understand. And I think, oh shit, I can sort that out afterwards. Yeah? But that is not the way the skilled negotiator thinks. The skilled negotiator is concerned with successful implementation of an agreement, not the obtaining of an agreement which won't work. Now, let's have a look at what happens. Because here again I was being very naive. When you watch the very skillful negotiator at work, what happens when the skilled negotiator says, hey, just let me test. Let me summarise the key points. I want to make absolutely certain you understand what it is you're agreeing to. Because it seems to me that you're about to sign something and you don't understand every piece of it. What happens when the other side withdraws and goes out into the other room? Well, usually they say, there's an honest guy. Yeah? There's someone who, you know, he could have kept quiet, we would have signed, then we would have been in trouble. So when they come back, do they generally come back in a mood for concession or not? Well, the answer is yes. They will come back much, much more likely to make a concession under those circumstances and to arrive at an agreement which may not be exactly what you wanted and might have got away with signing, but will be an agreement that they will stick to and make work and won't bound back on it. The world is full of people who can agree things one afternoon and the next morning the trouble starts. That, for me, is not the test of good negotiation. If you look at most negotiation programs, they encourage you not to clarify every piece before you get the agreement. Get that agreement. Oh, you can always do that afterwards. That's great if you're negotiating once and thereafter you only talk through lawyers. Yeah? Because if you have it on the contract, you've got it on the contract and you're safe. But think of where your business comes from. Yeah? How much significant business comes once and once only? And how often can you afford with that significant business to play it that way? I think the rule is this: always think of the successful implementation as your objective, not of the obtaining of an agreement. What matters is you get an agreement which will work, not just that you get an agreement. And that's one of the key differences between the skilled negotiator and the average negotiator. The average negotiator is too anxious to get an agreement and consequently will tend to leave all sorts of things very messy because they feel that to clear them up will jeopardize the agreement. If it jeopardizes the agreement before it's signed, sure as hell it will be 5 times that jeopardy afterwards. Never be afraid to raise those things. A lot of testing and understanding is important, and the reason why I raise that is I've noticed in my own behaviour before I've gone through all this research, and even while I was doing it, I would tend to do a lot of testing and summarising except where it mattered. The skilled negotiator does it most as they get nearest to agreement. That's when most of us stop doing it. Because the moment you feel the guy is coming your way, you don't want to do anything that could prevent that process. And in doing so, you may be storing up a lot of trouble for yourself, so watch it. I just want to include one small point here, because I had 4 on the other side, and I'll put 4 on this side. And that is if you look at the very effective negotiator, they tend to tell you a lot about their feelings and their perceptions. They use what we call a feelings commentary. They're talking all the time about what's going on inside their head. And that surprised us. Because what we thought would happen would be this. We felt that the good negotiator would be a very cold, very unemotional, very rational kind of person. Wouldn't talk on the level of feelings and perceptions. Would talk on the level of facts, issues, percentages. That's not true. You find the good negotiator is usually saying an awful lot about, when you said that, what you made me feel was, I'm now in some doubt about what I should do here, because I can see the point you're making, and I've got a lot of personal sympathy with that point. On the other hand, my mandate wouldn't let me take that, so I'm in a dilemma right now. And they would tend to say a lot about their feelings, and not necessarily honestly. I'll tell you a bit more about that later, but they would talk a lot about what was going on under the surface. And we wondered why this was. I suppose you could look at it in a very simple model where you look at people as a kind of iceberg. Actually, that looks more like a shark. There's a bit that sticks above the surface, and the bit that sticks above the surface is the bit you can see, the bit that we call behaviour, the bit that we've been observing in spin calls, the bit I've been talking to you about in my research. But under the water, there's a huge amount of other stuff. There's people's perceptions, motives, attitudes, things of this sort. Now, almost a simple way of saying that you feel you can trust someone, when you say you can trust someone, it means you can figure out from their behaviour what's under the water. Yeah? Think of someone who you feel you can trust. It's usually you know a lot about their motives, their attitudes, their beliefs, what they're feeling. All of these areas here of feelings are very important. If you look at someone that you can't figure out, what you're usually saying is, I can see the guy's behaviour, but I haven't a clue what's under the surface of this iceberg. And I just have a suspicion that what's under the surface ain't very nice. So, if you look at a skilled negotiator seems to create trust. It's worthwhile asking, what kind of behaviour do you use to create trust? And if you look at the negotiators who are very good, what they do is they'll talk to you a lot about how they're feeling. Yeah? How they're seeing things. So they'll be saying things like, I'm a little uncertain quite how I should proceed here, because here's the mechanism we're using in this big process, and we've talked to various other people, and personally I find myself quite liking the stuff that you've got, but I have a dilemma with my own management. The dilemma with my management is they are insisting on the spec in this kind of way. Now, how are you going to help with that dilemma? Immediately you say, hey, this guy's okay. But the guy who covers all that up and says, we are staying with the specification as in bid, how do you bid it come? Who's all rational, we don't feel the same way. So, by talking about some of the feelings underneath the surface, the skilled negotiator has people feeling more trust. Now, let me say straight away, do not take this as meaning that you should tell everyone what's in your case. I have a terribly embarrassing experience. I trained a group of people in Holland once, and I talked about this, and then I had the opportunity to watch one of them in a key negotiation. And this guy was very anxious to impress me with all that he'd learned from my sessions. So he came to the negotiation, and he said to the people that he was negotiating with, well, he said, you've got us across the barrel. We don't think we've got a case against you. We're in deep, deep trouble here, but I'm going to try to talk you out of it, at least to hold things for a while until we can get our act together. He very nearly succeeded because people were so astonished to hear that. I'm not saying that's how you should negotiate. What I am saying is this. There's no evidence the skilled negotiator is telling the truth about his or her feelings. But they do move off of the purely rational level and talk about their perceptions, how they're seeing things, how they feel about things. And it does seem that that's very important, because if you don't do that, you're cutting off a piece of yourself and everyone notices you've cut it off. You're just showing that piece. And people get all sorts of fears and concerns about what's under the surface. Well, that says something about negotiation. I could go on and say much more. But what I would like to do is just to cut this short, because I'm really rather dipping into some highlights from our research files, trying to pull out some things which from the 3 months we've had together working on this project and talking with you, I think is going to be helpful to you. Here, let me emphasize this one as being crucial. Do remember that. A weak argument dilutes a strong. Don't, under any circumstances, try to strengthen your case by tipping the balance of the argument in your favour. It doesn't work like that. Try and win it on strong, simple arguments. And that, I think, you'll find helpful. Especially as this is one aspect of our research which has got out and is beginning to get used, and is used in the training of buyers and purchasing agents quite extensively. And consequently, I make my living by training one side and then going off and training the other side, and we keep the sophistication going up. So watch out for this one. And the other thing, I would advise you, use a lot of testing and summarizing. Always check out there when you're negotiating it. Don't hope that things will tidy up afterwards. It's a false strategy.
Isn't there a danger there of illustrating to the other guy that he might be a dummy?
Well, it seems not to be. Because even if the other guy's worked it out, obviously with all these things, it depends how you say it. If you say, hey, look, you're so easy to calm, but if you say, on the other hand, can I just run through what I think each of these clauses means? Not saying, I'm assuming that you've got it wrong, but even saying, just for my own clarity, I'd like to be sure that I understand exactly what it is we're agreeing. Yeah? So you take the responsibility on yourself. I'm doing this for my benefit, you'll often say. So you don't say, no, listen, dummy, you obviously not understood. But so that's a matter, I think, of how you put it. But you're right, it does have to be put delicately, because you can upset people. But on the other hand, one of the things which is interesting, even if there is no disagreement between the parties, one of the things we do find is people who do a lot of that get themselves rated as very high for honesty by the other party. So even if you do it, it was unnecessary. It seems, in one sense, it did you good, because you were seen as trying to be absolutely scrupulously honest about what was in and what not in the agreement. Okay, I want to move on to one final area. This afternoon we'll discuss results, but now briefly I want to talk to you a little more about not negotiation but selling. And we continue this merry tale. Let me look a little beyond spin. The spin is not a universal sales tool by any means. It's a sales tool which has been designed for a specific piece of the selling cycle. It's not been designed for the whole selling cycle. There is no such tool which will cover absolutely everything. Let's have a look at a little graph where I will consider the utility of a behavior across the selling cycle. So we go from contact to contract here along the selling cycle. Along here, we look at utility, which, as I described to you once before, is measured by the predicted power against a battery of non-parametric tests. In other words, the higher it comes, the better it is. Now, spin is all about one key thing, and that is how to develop needs. Yeah? And you had to put spin in the sentence. You'd say it was a tool for uncovering and developing customer needs. Now, let's have a look at the importance of working on customer needs during the selling cycle. Is it going to be higher at some points of the cycle than others? Yes. Where? Where is it most important in the selling cycle to uncover needs? As early as you possibly can. And what you find is this. I put an N there for needs. The utility of working on needs looks like this. In the early part of the selling cycle, it brings you a lot of mileage. In the middle, it brings you some mileage. At the end, it can even count against you. Hey, I'd say, what is this jerk? If I've been talking with you 3 months and we're now getting very near the business, and I start asking you, please tell me about your problems. Yeah? I should know those things. So, what I want to share with you is, what do we currently know about what happens beyond needs? Because everything we've discussed in the last few months is in this area. Now, the reason why we've concentrated on that area is a simple one. That is the area that people do badly, and if they don't do that well, none of the other areas even happen. So everything depends on that area. It's by far the most important to the business. However, you can have people who do a pretty good job here but still aren't getting the business across here. I want to have a look at what we know from the research we've done about longer selling cycles. So I'm now talking to you about major pieces of selling, and this is not the sort of selling that your people would generally get involved in. This is a selling that you would get involved in. So I'm not talking to you about a message to take to your people. I'm talking to you specifically about things that may be helpful to your selling. Please don't go out and communicate this to your people, because you'll find it will probably confuse them. It's quite sexy stuff, but in our experience, you have to have this piece very firmly in place before you derive any benefit from the other things I'm talking about. Let's look at what tends to happen once you get to know needs. Suppose I'm selling to you, and I now know exactly what you need and don't need. I've got your explicit needs out on the table. I've made some benefits. We don't instantly have some business. I may have to look at 2 or 3 different people in your account. I may have to do a lot more selling. I may have to keep those needs hot. And also, something else happens. And we discovered this something else entirely the other way round. We discovered it not from research, but in this sense from just talking to people who were very, very experienced and noticing that they could do something that other salespeople couldn't. And that was this. Very experienced people who were very effective could usually say, let's have a look at the customer's guidelines for making the decision. And let's put those guidelines from very important or crucial all the way down to pretty incidental or unimportant. And what you'll be able to say is, for this customer, price is here. It's of middle importance. But delivery for this guy is very important indeed. If we can get on delivery, it will outweigh price. Specification doesn't mean a damn to this guy, because almost anything would do. Whereas we have another customer, of this customer, we've got the right spec and that'll get us in. He doesn't care at all about price or delivery. We're going to make it on spec alone. And what they could do is they could take the guidelines the customer was using to make a decision and could tell you something about the relative importance of each. Now, that gave us a clue about something to watch for. We started watching in calls for what people were doing in the middle of the cycle in order to understand those guidelines. They'd be asking questions like, you're saying you need this and this. Now, of those two, which one is more important to you? Which one really matters most? They'd be asking the kinds of questions to get guidelines out and to begin to manipulate their importance. Because the really skilled salesperson doesn't just neutrally get out guidelines. They use those guidelines actively to sell. So let me give you an example. Most people, when they make a decision, are not well aware of why they have made it. Yeah? For example, the biggest decision most of us make financially, usually, personally, is the purchase of a house. Now, could you tell me exactly what your decision guidelines were for buying a house? You know, what was the most important? What was moderately important? What was incidental? Very hard to do that. On the other hand, has anyone been house hunting recently? Here? Yeah? Well, if you've been house hunting, notice the difference in your house hunting when you've been doing it for a few weeks and when you start. When you start, you just have not a clue what you're doing. Yeah? Now you know you've got a need. No one will sell you a house by selling you a need for a house. Hey, you know that. That's done. You've got a strong explicit need. But what you haven't got is you haven't figured out the guidelines for deciding between this house and this house. But as you look at a lot of houses, what that process is doing is it's implanting in you guidelines. It's helping you see, yes, it is more important for us to have a large garden than it is to have a big kitchen. Well, we don't really need the extra whatever it is. Yeah? And you begin to see things that way. Now, when you look at how anyone makes a decision, without guidelines, literally, they can't make a decision. Now, let me give you an example. When I bought my first computer some years ago, when computers were still rather new and rather expensive things, and it was a big bucks decision, various salespeople came along and tried to sell me a computer. And they all tried to do it by convincing me I needed a computer. Of course I knew I needed a damn computer. That was not the point of the selling cycle. I'd already got to a point where I recognized my need. The guy who sold me a computer said, now, what you'll have to do is you're going to have to make some decisions. You're going to have to make some decisions in terms of the programming language you want. How important is it to you that you have a particular programming language? Or doesn't that matter? And what you'll also have to do is you'll have to decide on the type of storage. Now, here are your options. You have tape storage, you can have disk storage. Here are the pluses and minuses. On the basis of this, which of those would you say is more important to you? And as I talked to this guy, I found my guidelines were being set up in such a way as I went with that person. And I bought their computer even though I could have got, I now realize, identical hardware 20 to 25% cheaper. However, the person who helps you understand your guidelines is a person you place great reliance on. And what we find is decision guidelines tend to be at their most important in the middle of the cycle. They're important all through the cycle, but guidelines are at their most important here in the middle stage. So as you move from needs, you move towards guidelines. I won't forget how skillfully guidelines can be manipulated. I can't help telling you a story of what a sucker I am. An example of how guidelines are different from needs. I went into a camera store some years ago, and I said, I want a Vivitar Series 1 70 to 210 millimeter zoom with an Olympus OM fitting. Now, that was as explicit a need as you can get. Yeah? So, the sales guy, I found out afterwards, wasn't able to meet that need. And he didn't ask me a lot of questions about my needs, but what he did say was, he said, can I just ask you, you've got an Olympus camera, they're quite high quality cameras. Is the quality of the photographs you produce really crucial to you? And I said, oh yes. I said, well, then one of the things you'll find is a zoom lens isn't going to quite have the same degree of resolution and quality that you get from a range of fixed focus lenses. And I said, I see, well, I still really rather like the idea of a zoom, because, you see, I, getting myself into argument dilution, I go around the world a lot, and to carry one lens is feasible, but to carry 3 or 4 lenses is just out of the question. He said, so then you're saying quality is very important, and the other thing that's important to you is compactness or size. Is there anything else that would be of that level of importance? He said, no, those are the key things. He said, well, look, suppose I show you 3 fixed focus lenses, and we compare them with a zoom lens. As you'll see, overall, they actually aren't any larger, they're somewhat smaller. So, in terms of size and in terms of quality, you're going to do better with fixed focus lenses. I said, okay, who do I make the check payable to? Now, what I now realised was that my true guideline was for a leading great piece of glass on the front that I could zoom in and out and have fun with. A very flashy thing on the front of my camera. I now realise that that was my number one guideline. But at the time, that guy very skillfully manipulated my guidelines so that my whole view of my needs and how to fill it was changed. If you look at the long selling cycle, you are very often moulding people's guidelines in certain ways. Because people make decisions without being sure what the basis of those decisions are. I honestly didn't realise when I was making that decision what my guidelines were. I sort of thought, hey, I'd love a zoom lens. I looked at all the photographic magazines and I picked out one, and this looks a fancy lens. I read some reviews on it, and everyone said it was good, so I went to buy it. But my guidelines were pretty superficial, and the skill of sales tables have changed. Very simple. By actually challenging them, exploring them, bringing them up. Now notice again the difference between needs and a guideline. I had a strong explicit need, but I didn't have the guidelines for judging the alternative ways of meeting. What you'll find is a lot of your customers are in that position. The early part of the selling cycle has helped them clarify what they need to be able to do. They're now having to judge alternative ways of doing it, you and a competitor. And they, as you will know, often don't have up here the apparatus for doing it. Hey, when a new product comes on the market, think how difficult it is for you for a little while to appreciate what its strong points are and what its weak points are. If you can help a customer think through what matters and what doesn't matter, what it can do, what it can't do, then you're in a powerful position. So working on decision guidelines tends to be very important in the middle part of the time. I'd like to just show you one other thing very briefly. And this is a difficult area, and one which I have a lot of trouble explaining to people, but I think is nevertheless worth explaining. Like this. We'd find that the bigger the decision, the more when you got to the point in the cycle, you get a sort of backlash. For example, the sorts of things you'd have would be this. If you look at the customer concern over the cycle, I think your experience would confirm, wouldn't it? The customer tends to have a high price concern to begin with, and it comes up again just towards the end. We discussed this once before, I think. Yeah? So, the first time you're with a customer, you get a lot of issues about price coming out, then price seems to go into the background a little, and then just before the decision, up it comes. If you look at applications, what it is the product can do, that curve tends to cross like this. At first, the customer is more concerned with price than with what the product will do, In the middle of the cycle, more concerned with what it can do. That's where decision guidelines are very powerful. At the end, becomes very concerned again with price. Now the question is, why should this concern happen? And how do you deal with it? And one of the things that you'll find is, if you're selling anything significant, price is not just a dollar figure. In the business you're in, you are selling often a major change. Often a change totally in the way someone's doing business. To really capitalize on what you're selling, people are going to have to alter their procedures. They may have to alter their systems. There may be a lot of change they'll bring about. So the price they have to pay is not only a dollar price, there's prices in terms of risk, prices in terms of hassle, prices in terms of people's reaction, and all those things tend to flow in on you when you are just about to make a decision. Now, how do you deal with it? The first thing you find is successful people don't try and sweep it under the table. The less successful people will try, when they get towards the end, to close hard on those big contracts. But ask yourself psychologically whether that works. One of the things we know is if anyone is making a big decision, suppose you're making a big decision about whether to change your job, and someone then puts pressure on you, the chances are you will not make the change. One of the things that, for example, top executive recruiters are taught, quite rightly, is if you want to attract someone, when they are in the process of making that key decision, play it very cool. Don't try and close them into taking the job, because when the bigger the decision, the more negative the effect of pressure. If you pressure people at the end of the cycle, then you're in trouble, because they'll feel the pressure and they're already scared. This climb in the price curve is a fear-motivated climb. You put them under pressure and you increase that fear. So what do you do? Because clearly it's not effective to leave people alone, especially to leave them alone when there's a competitor in there doing things. Now what we find is that the people who are very successful tend to, towards the end of this cycle, work on an area that we call consequences. They try to get out onto the table from the customer what those fears and concerns are. They try to get them out not in terms of saying, if I were you, which of course I'm not, I wouldn't worry about that, which of course you are. They actually say, yes, that is a legitimate fear. The guy who says, I'm scared that my people aren't going to accept this new gear of yours. If you jump in too quickly and say, yeah, it'll be perfectly acceptable, don't worry about that, then all you're telling them is that they shouldn't tell you any more, because and that fear will continue underneath, and the decision will go against you. If anyone expresses a fear, it's tremendously important to bring that up on the table, to say, at this stage, when you're getting very near to making the decision, I guess you've got some concerns. And really, it might be useful to just talk about what those concerns are. And get the guy to talk about them, and whenever that happens, instead of denying it's an important issue, you should encourage them. To use techniques like, if you watch very good people, they deal with consequences by things like saying, yeah, firstly, they put themselves on the same side. I can appreciate why you feel that. In fact, quite a large number of my customers have had that same reaction before they bought. But, and then they give third-party type reference. I think I could arrange for you to go and see this guy who had exactly that problem. We managed to understand ways of resolving it outside and problem-solving those things tend to become very, very important. Now here, I can't go into all of the techniques for resolving consequences, except to say the bigger the decision, the more carefully those have to be handled.